this presentation that I'm going to give today is a little bit different, and it's something that I think is really important. And so that's why I've kind of like on the side of writing a dissertation, which I should be focusing all my attention to. I'm also working on this because I just think it's something we need to talk about. Okay, so the name of the paper is, very long academic-y title, Digital Prostheses, a Phenomenological Approach to Understanding the Problem of Non-Consensual Pornography. I hope to unpack that all, and that all is clear and makes sense here by the end of this presentation. But before I move forward, I want to say that I want to acknowledge that much of what I'm going to be discussing today it draws on a long-time collaboration with a friend and a colleague of mine named Whitney Erin Basil. And I just want to make sure to give her credit. There's us at the conference Elaine was talking about, Theorizing the Web, a couple years ago, and teamwork, right? So I just want to say that a lot of these insights I can't take sole credit for, and she has been an important part of developing this set of ideas now for a couple years, even though I put this particular presentation together. Okay. So Whitney and my work explores the way digital technologies relate to the body and how it shapes our experiences of the other. Okay, and as a culture, I'd argue that we've always struggled to make sense of how digital technologies fit into our embodied experience. In our collective fantasies about life in a digitally mediated world, especially going back to the 1980s, bodies were often placed off stage. And so here I'm using the example of The Matrix. If you remember, Neo wakes up and that goo, and it's like, oh, I've been living in a fantasy, right? That was sort of the stand-in for the internet and The Matrix, right? And then alternatively, bodies might have been altogether annihilated, and that's how that was sort of the metaphor that Tron used, this idea of de-resing. You had to be zapped down by a laser to enter cyberspace, right? If probably a lot of you maybe saw the Tron remake recently. This is from the original, which is better. So I like to start there, just sort of looking at the way that we've collectively imagined cyberspace and the role of our bodies which in a weird way, our bodies were totally negated in that conception of cyberspace. And that actually it comes deeply from the history of cybernetic theory, which I'm not going to get super into, but suffice it to say that in cybernetic theory, there was this idea that essentially information and the material stuff of the world were separable, which is really just the 5 millionth incarnation of the mind-body problem in Western civilization. But that very much underlaid the sort of ethos of Silicon Valley and also of Hollywood as we were developing these technologies. But at the same time, there was also a simultaneous pushback to that sort of binary conception of the body and information. One of my favorite authors, Catherine Hales, makes this poignant statement. I think she says, in kind of a sense of frustration, she's actually reading through all sorts of fiction about the web, and also at the same time reading through all of the proceedings of all of these old cybernetic conferences. And she says, how could anyone think that consciousness in an entirely different medium would remain unchanged, as if it had no connection with embodiment, right? And so the idea that and we see this, again, as part of our fantasies for a long time, that idea that we could just upload our mind into a computer and we'd somehow be the same person. She's like, no, that's BS. That experience of inhabiting a body deeply shapes who you are and how you experience the world. And as soon as you, if it were possible, as soon as you were to transfer that into a different medium, that would fundamentally change who you are, what consciousness was like in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine. These are problems that, again, fiction and has been wrestling with for a long time. I like to turn to that because that it's sort of in speculation we're able to try to work out some of these problems. So you look at a book like William Gibson's Neuromancer, and he's trying to deal with exactly that, what what would it be like if you didn't even have a body? What if your consciousness could be translated into just a piece of software that existed out on the web? Could we really say that you would experience the world in the same way? And Catherine Hale says, no, that's whatever the case may be, it's like our embodiment is fundamental to how we experience the world and who we are, and like medium matters. And that whole mind-body problem that has persisted in Western culture throughout all of history, she just says like, she tries to make the case that like that's always rooted in this notion that we can translate consciousness across media, and that starting point is is problematic and like doesn't hold up to like any. I mean, of course, we haven't developed these technologies yet, but on the other hand, it just like it's simply like even as we work through it in the imagination, it just doesn't seem plausible. Okay. Now, I just want to take like a brief aside here. I'm about more or less about this speaker series. At the moment when they seem most necessary, body-centric feminist theorists seem to be less visible or less and less visible in conversations about technologies, even sometimes now being described as passé. We particularly hear that in relation to cyborg theory now. And so I'm like really thrilled to be here having this conversation, because I think that, ironically, while this is, being called passé, these sort of feminist technoscience theories of a body that is connected to technology, the ways in which the body is interconnected to technology, are more relevant than ever. So this is great. And I think also ultimately gets back to this question of like, this isn't all of these questions that we're talking about embodiment and the way that embodiment structures consciousness. This isn't ever gender neutral, right? Like everything I'm going to say in this presentation is gendered. When we talk about bodies, when we talk about embodiment and consciousness, it's always implicitly gendered because bodies are gendered, right? And so, we don't want to say that. Bodies are sexed, and we attribute gender to them, but there is a physical differentiation there that I think is important, and I don't think we ever want to leave sex and gender out of these sorts of conversations, and people like Donna Haraway do a great job of reminding us of that. Okay, so now getting to the heart of it. What brought Whitney and I to focus on the intersection of technology and bodies are serious social justice issues implicated in how we interpret these relationships. In the past, we've studied so-called cyberbullying, that we would argue that bullying, whether it is bullying, whether it's online or offline. But today I want to focus on another pressing issue, which is non-consensual pornography, or as it's more commonly known, revenge porn. So how we define non-consensual pornography is nude or sexually suggestive images shared in a manner or context that the subject did not consent to, often with the intent to humiliate, intimidate, or extort the victim. And in fact, extortion is increasingly common in these cases. We now hear the term sextortion, people who post photos and then demand payments to take the photos down. This is sort of a growing trend. Okay, but like before we jump into the meat and sort of philosophical heart of this conversation, what I'd really like to do is kind of put a human face on it. And so I'm going to start with Jennifer Lawrence. For those unaware, Jennifer Lawrence and many other celebrities' iCloud accounts were hacked a couple of years ago in an event called Slubgate in the news, and far more commonly on the internet, the fappening. I'll let you look that up, or not. And so I could read you a quote from her, but to be honest, she was just on Fresh Air not too long ago talking to Terry Gross. I could read that, but to be honest, I think actually the emotional content in her voice is as important as what she said. So I'm going to just go ahead and let her do the talking for herself.
When it happened to me, I wasn't embarrassed. I was in a long-distance relationship for 4.5 years. And even if I wasn't in a long-distance relationship, it wouldn't matter. It was my body, it was my private email. I had the freedom to do what I wanted, and I was angry. Hackers are hackers, and the hackers are gross, disgusting perverts, and what they did was wrong. And that goes without saying, but the idea that when something becomes popular, all of a sudden it's now okay. It's just shocking how it's not personal to people anymore. That's why people can say whatever they want about me and in the news, or they can hear me say one thing about me not liking popcorn and then judge my entire personality. It's like as soon as you're a celebrity, it's so impersonal. But those pictures were incredibly personal to me. And my naked body, I haven't shown on camera. I haven't done anything, by choice. It's my body. And I felt angry at websites reposting them. And I can't really describe to you the feeling that took a very long time to go away, wondering at any point who's just passing my body around, who's got a picture of my body on their phone and is at a barbecue and looking at them, or it was an unshakable, really, really awful feeling that after it healed a little bit, made me incredibly angry.
So Jennifer Lawrence is speaking as somebody who, as you all know, is already in the spotlight 24/7, right? Like she's, lives a life where she's accustomed to attention, but like at the same time, you can see how obviously and deeply affected she was by this, right? And like, so I mean, I just say that insofar as like, you can see how a celebrity, an A-list celebrity, is affected by this. You can imagine how somebody who's accustomed to a much greater degree of privacy would be affected. And so I think that's important. I also like using her as an example just because she is very public about this. And so I think it's okay to, share her story since she's sharing it herself. But also notice how strongly she identifies with the images. She speaks as though her person is being passed around at these hypothetical barbecues, right? She never even says the images. She says they're passing around her body, right? And I'll come back to the importance of that in a minute, but I just kind of want to let that sink in because I think that's key. But let me talk a little more first about what revenge porn or non-consensual pornography looks like in general, and sort of the debates, or I don't want to say debates, but the press attention that's been given to this in recent years, which has been growing exponentially, I would say, in the past 2 years, as has the prevalence of this kind of non-consensual pornography as well. Okay, so the most infamous site was called, and I say was because it no longer exists, is anyoneUp.com. It allowed users to post amateur pics they took of ex-girlfriends, pictures of people having sex at parties, women in public, and in some cases it paid contributors who provided those sorts of images. Its creator, Hunter Moore, embraced the label which was given to him as the most hated man on the internet. That's a picture of him. Okay. The website existed for just a couple years before Moore shut it down in 2012, complaining that he spent an average of 3 hours a day reporting naked submissions from underage fans. However, Moore wasn't arrested until 2014. And in December, he accepted a plea deal of 2.5 years in prison for unauthorized access of a protected computer to obtain information for the purposes of financial gain, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. But note that he was only charged in connection with the piles that he purchased from hackers, and not from the much larger number of lawfully obtained non-consensual pornographic images. And yes, that sentence does make sense under current federal law, right? So it was only because he paid hackers who hacked computers and stole images that way that he was prosecuted. Had he not done that, the vast majority of all his other activity would have been legal under federal law. Okay. All right, so I want to then stop for a moment here in developing this story and just say that what I'm not going to do, I want to make this clear, and I also kind of want to push the conversation after my presentation in this direction. What I want to make clear is that what I'm not going to do is blame women for taking pictures or allowing themselves to be photographed, right? Like, probably like 3,000 years ago, someone's parents were like, maybe you shouldn't be writing letters to your lovers because those things have a way of getting out. People are reading that written word. It's pretty dangerous. And the thing is that humans have and always will use whatever media are accessible to them for intimacy and for sexuality. And I think that we really, in this case, need to move back past both victim blaming, but also medium blaming, which is a constant refrain of the media, which I know is like a weird sentence, the journalistic press. So I just kind of, I wanted to lay that out. And then I want to also say that, like it or not, taking and sharing photos is increasingly common among young adults. And so I have some data. This is really excellent data from Pew, nationally representative data. And Pew, there's a couple interesting things here. One, we see that by far, young adults ages 18 to 24 report receiving the most sexually suggestive pictures and videos, 44% in that demographic. And young adults 25 to 34 are the group that are most likely to send these images. 22% within that age group send, or 1/5 basically of people between the ages of 25 and 34 say they've sent sexually suggested images. And that's 2013 data, okay? So that's already like 3 years ago. And the Pew reports say that 18% of people 18 to 29, so that's like aggregate, that's what I would consider young adults, right? I dug into data to get that number because I think that's probably most relevant to most of the students at Duquesne. So 18% of people in that group have sent a sexually suggested image, and that's up from only 13% in 2009. So in 4 years, it increased that much. My expectation is between the 3 years since this last survey was taken and now, it's probably also increased that much again. So in other words, we're probably looking at something like a quarter of people in the young adult category who send sexually suggestive images. And so what the press has to say, whatever moralists have to say aside, the truth is that this is increasingly common. It's an increasingly common practice. It may not be normal or normalized in the sense that it may still be stigmatized or judged, but it is, empirically speaking, increasingly typical in our culture. And we should understand that as we think about these issues. So getting back to our friend Hunter Moore, I want to say too that the shame on you for taking nude photos, sort of victim blaming, is one of the ways that perpetrators themselves often justify these actions, right? And so he was on Anderson Cooper's talk show confronting people whose images he had shared, and his justification, he said, well, there's one easy way to never end up on my website. It's by not taking those photos. And so he himself sort of justifies his own activity on the basis of victim blaming. But what the attention to the Is Anyone Up saga potentially obscures, though, is that there are still hundreds of little Hunter Moores running similar, less visible forums across the web, as well as many other distributions for non-consensual pornography that are being used regularly. So up till now, we were only talking about dedicated web forums, and particularly this one dedicated web forum. But there's also numerous subforums on Reddit and 4chan and the many, many offshoots of those sites. There are what are frequently called dump accounts, where someone will start an anonymous account on Twitter or Tumblr. And usually these are geographically specific, so like specific to a high school, specific to a college. And they'll accept and post images that are sent to them from people in that community and sort of dump them out on the web anonymously. There are torrent sites, and this is particularly a way in which the celeb nude photos that we discussed, like with Jennifer Lawrence, are circulated. And then there's also the dark web, which requires not only a certain degree of technical savvy, but like some actual insider knowledge of how to find certain websites. But those, usually through the Tor network, And those I think are particularly places where like really illegal stuff like underage pornography is distributed. But there are all these different mechanisms and probably other mechanisms that I haven't covered. And so it's this is quite pervasive is the point I'm trying to make here. So historically, copyright has been the main legal tool for prosecuting. At least in the case of selfies, this sort of non-consensual pornography. So what does that mean? Well, women who took selfies, and it's typically women, could say, well, I took that photo. I'm the copyright holder. So therefore, you are misusing this content, which I have a legal copyright to. But there's some real absurd consequences to that being the legal mechanisms through which non-consensual pornography is, attempted to be prosecuted. And I'm going to turn here to John Oliver because he does like a more succinct and far more humorous job of explaining those problems than I could. So I'll give you a little minute with.
You could ask the website to take the photos down if you own the copyright. But if they refuse, then winning your lawsuit might entail doing something absolutely mind-blowing.
You can sue, but to do that, you've got to register the copyright. Which brings us to the cold, hard truth. In the most extreme case, you've got to send pictures of your naked body to the Copyright Office. That's in Washington.
Yes. To stop strangers from seeing pictures of their naked body, some women have had to send more strangers more pictures of their naked body. We are one step away from trying to protect our children in the future by having the copyright symbol tattooed onto their genitals at birth. Look, just to be safe, let's take her to Viper's Ink Shack. We don't know what kind of arsehole she could end up meeting. This situation is insane. And as one expert found, the official response to victims ranges from offensive to ridiculous.
Well, let me just say they're going to show Danielle Citron. And part of the reason I like this clip is because she really is the foremost legal expert on the topic of non-consensual pornography.
I've interviewed 60 victims of online harassment. What they're often told is, look, either if it's revenge porn, you shared pictures with your ex, he owns it now. Like, sorry that you trusted the person, but it's kind of your fault, right? Or they're told, look, if it's just harassment generally, like turn off your computer, ignore it, it'll go away.
But turn off your computer is simply not practical. Almost every job requires the internet now. Somewhere right now in the world, there is a yak herder going, why is the Wi-Fi so slow? I'll herd these yaks after lunch.
All right, let me just pull this back up. Forgive me for the technical difficulties. I thought John Oliver was worth it. Apart from everything that John Oliver says, the reason why the copyright issue is offensive is because the thing that really upsets us about this issue, about the issue of non-consensual pornography, isn't a misuse of content, right? Or like a property violation, a violation of someone's property rights. But it's a violation of someone's right to self-determination that I think we find offensive, right? And in this case, their self-determination with regards to what happens to their own bodies, right? And so I'd argue that non-consensual pornography is much more akin to sexual assault than it is to pirating music via BitTorrent, which is more or less the way that the legal system has treated it up until this point. Though I have to say here, it is changing. There are now 23 states with laws on the books that deal with revenge porn on one level or another, but still no federal law. And let's face it, when you're talking about stuff on the internet, it's the federal laws that matter. The internet doesn't really give a shit about state lines. And so it's very hard to enforce these things without federal laws, though possible. Okay, so what I want to do here is try to make sense of the deeper relationships going on. Not the ones bound up in copyright, property, and ownership, but the ones about our subjective experience and the sense of violation we feel when the control we have over ourselves is taken from us. I think the issue of revenge porn points to a more intimate relationship with technology than phenomenologists and other theorists that phenomenologist, another theorist, articulated in many ways over the course of the past century, but hasn't seemed to quite achieve popular or legal recognition. And so particularly I'm interested in the experience of incorporation, which, as I define here, is the idea that we can come to experience a foreign object as being part of our body and part of ourselves. So let me try to talk about what is meant by incorporation here. Philosopher by the name of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, if anybody studies philosophy here, this name probably won't be unfamiliar. He explains this in a couple different ways. He describes incorporation as those actions in which I habitually engage incorporate their instruments into themselves and make them play a part in the original structure of my own body. And then to kind of get a little more concrete, he says, to get used to a hat, a car, a stick, is to be transplanted into them, or conversely, to incorporate them into the bulk of our own body. Habit expresses our power of dilating our being in the world or changing our existence by appropriating fresh instruments. So here he's, to kind of put that in plain English, he's focusing on the way that habitually interacting with objects changes the way we perceive them. And if we go back a little further in history, again, probably someone that any philosophy folks here might be familiar with, Martin Heidegger gives us this idea that tools such as a hammer can become almost invisible to us so long as they function properly. We feel as though our agency extends through such objects. And coming back to Merleau-Ponty, and I really like this example. He talks now about a blind man's cane, and he says, once a stick becomes a familiar instrument, the world of feelable things recedes and now begins, not at the outer skin of the hand, but at the end of the stick. The pressures on the hand and the stick are no longer given. The stick is no longer an object perceived by the blind man, but an instrument with which he perceives. And I would say that, so we've kind of talked about how habit incorporates objects, though I would probably take a different tack and say, maybe even more profound than the examples Merleau-Ponty gives are tattoos and piercings and other forms of bodily modification in which things are, so literally incorporated into our body. And, I still think arguably shape our perceptions and our experiences of the world. Social theory has some things to say about this too, particularly Marshall McLuhan expanded this kind of notion, suggesting that electronic media are an extension of our entire central nervous system. And I love an example he gives here and elsewhere, where he talks about the way that we experience driving in a car and how, you can go on a long road trip and the car seems to dissolve away. Like, you literally become unaware of the fact that you're driving. Like, you're not like, I need to push down the gas pedal now. I will sit here and keep the wheel straight. Like, you're just thinking about other things. It's just like, you feel as though you're part of the car and you're just unconsciously driving this, 2,000-pound thing barreling down the highway at 70 miles per hour. And I don't know, I've had that experience myself, like, before I ever read this. And I was like, yeah, that's a thing. Like, that's interesting. And I think that moment is one of these instances where we're getting something akin to this idea of incorporation. But most interesting to me was a case study analyzed by a Duquesne alum named Amy Taylor. I think she's in the psychology department here. Oh, good, some people, yep. And so, she talks about a man who was left impotent after treatment for prostate cancer. And this is a study that was also published in a medical journal. And to his surprise, he discovers that he can experience orgasm using a strap-on dildo with his wife. So he straps the dildo onto himself and is able to experience orgasm. And so Taylor kind of concludes that the patient went from regarding the dildo as a piece of purple plastic to an organ of his own body, and experiences the dildo as such, evidenced not only by his explicit statements, but by his ability to achieve sexual satisfaction through the dildo. A striking example of an object working in concert with the body or extending the body beyond the skin. I don't know. I just think that's like mind blowing that that's the case, and I think it's hard to imagine a more literal or compelling example of how the intensity of this process of incorporation is experienced. Okay, so I think the most radical aspect of our ability to incorporate objects into the body is the recognition that human subjectivity extends beyond the flesh, that objects become part of us, part of our perception of the world, and part of our perception of ourselves. We generally describe such incorporated objects as prostheses, right? That makes sense. And Whitney and I have argued that this is how we come to relate to our social media profiles and our smartphones. And so we've argued in the past that, this cane, you experience it as part of you, and in many ways we've come to experience our smartphones as part of us, as shaping our perception of the world. And certainly our social media profiles in the same way. Now let me reference back to Jennifer Lawrence. Remember, she's talking about these images that she took with her smartphone of herself. And when she talks about them, she doesn't say, those images of me. No, she says me, my body, right? Like, she's very much experiencing them and referencing them as part of herself. This incorporation of these digital prostheses is why when someone makes a negative comment, we feel hurt. And if they hack our accounts, we feel violated. If we lose our phone, we sometimes feel lost. These objects have become digital prostheses. And like Heidegger's hammer, when these technologies work well, they seem to nearly vanish from our perception, creating the possibility for intimacy, for meaningful connection, perhaps one that is even felt physically between two or more people. And this perspective suggests that if we're going to make sense of revenge porn as assaulting a person and not just an inappropriate use of property, then we need to stop reifying conventionally held boundaries between subject and object, producer and product, person and thing, and I'd even say online and offline. The concept of digital prostheses suggests an extension of moral regard beyond flesh and blood to all things a person experiences as integral to his or her subjectivity. I think that's kind of like the heart of the case I want to make here. And I'm following in the footsteps of Sandy Stone, who also examined the intimacy of our relationships with machines. In her observations back in the 90s or late 80s of a phone sex collective, she suggests that what was being sent back and forth over the wires wasn't just information, it was bodies. Stone coined the term split subjectivity to describe subjectivity embodied by two or more media. In other words, phone sex operators were not only embodied by flesh and blood, but also by the medium through which they worked. However, rather than emphasizing the distinctiveness of the materials that mediate our experience, as she does, we prefer to emphasize the coherence and continuity of that experience. So we choose to call it augmented subjectivity. And again, this goes back to that idea of online and offline and the overlapping of the two, that there's not just like an online self and an offline self, which probably is, sort of like common sense to everyone sitting, most everyone sitting in this room if you grew up with the internet. But on the other hand, the way that the media, the way that fiction before the internet even existed talked about the internet, it was always as though it was a frontier, a separate world that we were going to get zapped into or wake up in a pile of goo out of. And so, that's part of the reason why we want to talk about augmented subjectivity, as if we're not, I'm not online and then now I'm offline. No, we're always, in connection to what's going on in the physical world and in the digital world. And those two things are very much like integral to one another in our contemporary world. So one chief assumption of this perspective is that all interactions and experiences are mediated, that flesh itself is a medium. And this is key and I think controversial. So flesh itself is a medium, which means there's no such thing as an unmediated interaction, which is how people quite frequently talk about face-to-face communication as being unmediated. And I would contend, no, it's flesh-mediated interaction. And flesh-mediated interaction might be different than digitally mediated, interaction mediated by my webcam, which is still also mediated by the flesh. But it is mediated. It's not unmediated interaction. And again, this is important to feminism because we're talking about bodies here, right? And there's been a tendency historically to separate the body and the consciousness, right? And I don't want to do that. I want to say here that yes, flesh is a medium. It always shapes consciousness. It always shapes the way we think and experience the world. And I think that's key both to this problem, but I think to a broader conversation about mediated bodies for a women's and gender studies speaker series. Okay, so I'd argue that no interactions are any more or less real than other interactions. Again, just differently mediated. And this, of course, is also another sort of buzzword in the media, and not just in the media, but it's like a meme. We talk about online and real life all the time. Like that's a common way of talking about our interactions, and I totally reject that. I think we should throw away the idea of the real and the virtual. I think those tend to be incredibly misleading ways of talking, as though someone sends a bunch of sexually harassing emails, that's somehow less real than if they walk up to the person and say the exact same thing to their face. No, both are equally as offensive. The medium doesn't make it less real. We've got to get over that as a society, and I think that it's long overdue, and I hope millennials can rid us of this weird scourge of binary thinking that persists in talking about technology. I have hope. Okay, and then I will say that fellow nerds might recognize these stills from the 1995 film Ghost in the Shell. Yeah, it's a great film. I screen capped these myself for this presentation. You can ask Jesse. I was sitting there got to get the high definition version to put it in my slideshow. And so Ghost in the Shell, along with countless other sci-fi narratives, particularly those of the cyberpunk genre. So again, going back to William Gibson or something, imagine consciousness inhabiting bodies other than those consisting of flesh and blood. And that's great. I think we should connect more with that stuff and use it to think about how we're experiencing these sort of contemporary conditions of differently mediated interactions. Okay, so I definitely want to leave time left for conversation. I know that this has already been fairly long. I'll close by saying this, that these objects, these pictures and profiles, that they are us in some important sense. At least that's what I've hoped to argue in this presentation in the limited time that I've had. And I think they seem to merit greater respect and protection than can be provided by laws and norms against simple property theft. I think that we need to expand our sense of moral regard to accommodate the new digitally mediated reality that's confronting us. And I hope that we can have a great conversation about how to do that. So thanks.